So, considering the time of day that I saw this, you can say that I saw the Batman on a dark night. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a little film you may or may not have heard of, The Batman. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content like DC and Marvel reviews on a near-daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about The Batman. This stars Robert Pattinson as the title character, who ventures into Gotham City's underworld when a sadistic killer known as the Riddler, played by Paul Dano, leaves behind a trail of cryptic clues. This is directed by Matt Reeves, who also co-wrote the screenplay, and we all know how the story goes with production of this one. It was initially envisioned as a solo project for Ben Affleck's Batman, and it was going to be set within the DCEU, but slowly but surely, things began to crumble and Affleck eventually dropped out of the project. Matt Reeves came in, and he removed all the DCEU elements, and instead he focused on a brand new Batman in a brand new continuity. And while I wish we got a Batman solo project within the DCEU so that it makes that a more cohesive universe rather than doing all these offshoot films, I was still very excited when I heard Matt Reeves would be behind this. I've seen all of his films since Cloverfield, and every one of them has been a knock out of the park for me, especially giving us an English language remake of a foreign language film that's arguably just as good as the original with Let Me In, along with two excellent entries in the Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy, one of which being just about on par with the iconic 60s film, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. And while this wasn't quite at the top of my most anticipated movies of the year list, as there were just so many intriguing films to be on the lookout for this year, I still had high hopes for this one, as Reeves has yet to disappoint. And, once again, he knocks it out of the park here. This is another fantastic entry in the Batman filmography, and it's one that's completely engrossing from start to finish. Now, while this is another ultra dark and gritty take on the character, and there are story elements we've seen before once again here, it still ultimately offers something different for Batman. Unlike the crime thriller, Michael Mann-like vibe that we got from the Nolan Dark Knight trilogy, this takes on a tone that mixes film noir with David Fincher films like Zodiac or Seven. This highlights the detective side of Batman, which is something I know plenty of fans have wanted to see in quite some time, as we really never got to explore that side of the character. Now, while there's plenty of superhero action here, including a gripping third act, that's also not the domineering force. Instead, the main focus is Batman, along with Jim Gordon, played by Jeffrey Wright, putting clues left by the Riddler together and trying to get one step ahead of this grand plan he has laid out. Now, I love a good old-fashioned mystery movie, and the way this plays out, it reminded me a lot of the Batman Arkham games, which are some of my favorite Batman-related media out there for their expansive world building, their puzzles, and their focus on Batman's detective skills. So I ate all that up for this film, and with this, the primary relationship we focus on here is that of Batman and Gordon. While there are a number of dynamics we explore all throughout the film, theirs is the most prominent by far. This takes place 2 years into Batman's time on the street, and at this point, Gordon's the only one who really trusts him, letting him into crime scenes where no one else really wants him around, and consulting him over his other colleagues. And the chemistry between Wright and Pattinson was solid, with a nice buddy vibe to it that leads to a lot more comedic moments than you think. And that's the one thing that I think people forget with even these really darker versions of Batman. Like, this was the case even with the Nolan movies. Even when we got a more serious take on the character, he can still actually be pretty funny without the film bordering on goofy territory. There were plenty of good one-liners in the Nolan films that were injected just at the right time without making them feel tonally jarring, and that's once again the case here. I know people sometimes seem to have an issue when you have apparently too many jokes in a superhero movie, and they prefer this dark and gritty material, but I think you need a little bit of that balance in these films because you don't want these movies to be just nothing but depressing. Really, in any movie, I've said this before, but you want a wider range of emotions in there as it gives to a nice tonal balance. You don't need to throw in so many jokes that it feels jarring or anything, but having a moment in there that expresses something other than extreme sadness is a good way of cutting the tension every so often, and it can go a long way. Like, if you go back to a lot of the films from the late 2000s and early 2010s that tried to do a gritty reboot of a beloved franchise, clearly inspired by Nolan, with some exceptions, you'll notice a lot of them seem to miss what made those films so compelling. The Nolan Batman movies would be dark and gritty, but they knew how to have some fun as well, making for well-rounded entertainment, while a lot of these films inspired by Nolan forgot how to have that fun. And this is a film that doesn't forget that. I thought the way the tonal balance was handled here was nicely done. There's even a running gag placed in the film involving Batman entering a nightclub 3 different times under 3 different scenarios that I particularly enjoyed and thought was timed well. And it didn't take away from this being an eerie, compelling mystery drama. And another big source of humor here, as well as another highlight of the movie, is Colin Farrell as the Penguin, who starts off here mainly as a right-hand man of Carmine Falcone, played by John Turturro, rather than being the kingpin he later becomes known as. And he was so much fun, probably giving us the biggest source of humorous moments with this overly expressive delivery. And the makeup on him was also fantastic. I know this has been said countless times already when the trailers dropped how he looked unrecognizable in the role, but there are times he really disappears into the role, which is a statement I try not to use all that often. Now, you can tell every so often that it's Colin Farrell from a certain angle or from the way he delivers a certain line, but it really feels for the most part like watching a different person. Like, there were times I forgot it was him. So not only was that incredible, but because of just how much fun the character was, I just had a blast watching him. And there's a moment involving him that was one of my favorite moments in the entire film altogether, which you can see in the trailer involving a car chase. And it's one of my favorites for multiple reasons. One is just the way it was shot and staged. Like I said, while the action's not the domineering focus of the film, when we get it, it was damn well done from the way it was all choreographed. But another reason is actually another aspect that I just loved about the film as a whole. Michael Giacchino's score is easily one of my favorite film scores I've heard in a film in some time. Like, rarely do I comment on a film score in a non-musical, but this one really stuck with me for its bombastic feel and the way it would drive scenes forward in a seemingly organic way, especially during a particularly tense moment. The Penguin car chase scene, as I said, is easily my favorite use of that score, just for the way it masterfully cranks things up and flows with the action. I really gotta commend Jacquino here. I know Hans Zimmer's scores for the Dark Knight trilogy are considered iconic, and I don't want to turn this review into a comparison between the two, but I think this is up there along with them as one of the best. And even though I described some moments earlier as having this sense of fun, that still doesn't take away from the fact that this is a violent, darker, much more realistic take on Batman. Probably even more realistic than the Nolan films. We even see it in the way Batman carries himself as Bruce Wayne, and it's worth noting, we primarily see Batman in the suit for about 95% of the film. As Bruce Wayne, it's only a minimal amount of screen time. But this iteration of Bruce isn't the suave playboy like Christian Bale's version. Instead, he's a broken shell who's deeply affected by the trauma of his parents dying, which he carries with him to this day. And that also plays into his quest to serve as this symbol of vengeance as Batman. When he's in the suit, he can be so blinded by his desire to instill fear into his adversaries, but when he's Bruce, he's quiet, reserved, and he's clearly shown to just not be a people person in general. The only one he really has a sustainable relationship with is Alfred, played by Andy Serkis. Now, regarding Serkis' performance, he was a great Alfred, and I thought the way he acts as this mentor figure to Bruce provided for some nice moments, especially due to the chemistry between Serkis and Pattinson. Though I think that was the one element of the film that I think could have been explored just a bit more. Even at 3 hours, there were some elements that didn't get touched upon as much as they should have that I would have liked had they dedicated just a few more minutes to them, which I think is just going to happen when you have a world as big as this, but the relationship between Alfred and Bruce, as well as the way that Bruce's past ties into who he is now, does wind up being a big moment later on in the film. However, because we only see Batman as Bruce for such a small part of the film, that means we also only see Alfred for only such a small part of the film. And while their scenes together were great, we really only got to explore very little with them in the earlier parts, and because of that, it just doesn't make the ending to their particular storyline hit as hard as I think it should have. And I think they could have thrown in a few extra minutes worth of material to dedicate to this, and it wouldn't have done much to the pacing, because honestly, at 3 hours, I did not feel the runtime for the most part. And that's something tricky to pull off, as there have been plenty of films that go for that 2.5 hour plus runtime, and they clearly feel bloated. But honestly, this was paced exceptionally well for the way it balanced so many great subplots and storylines. Again, there's the occasional thing that gets shafted, mainly the Alfred stuff, but for the most part, the film manages to go in so many different directions and cover so much ground, and it doesn't feel aimless or overlong. And going back to that real world aesthetic, the way the Riddler is played here is definitely a far cry from the Jim Carrey days, with an emphasis on the fact that he's a serial killer. I mean, there are still plenty of those classic Riddler elements in there, but this is someone who you could see running around in real life, especially with the way the character extensively uses the darker depths of social media to get his message out there. Now, there isn't quite as much depth to the character here, despite being the main villain. Like, I'd say he's more of a presence that looms over the film for some stretches of time, rather than someone we get a complex character study about. But even if we go on for some time without seeing him, he makes quite an impact each time we do see him. And Paul Dano does an excellent job of bringing that sinister creepiness to him. That's always been one of his stronger suits, playing either these slimy, evil individuals or people who are clearly disturbed. And here it adds nicely to that sense of dread. Which leads to another element I really enjoyed about this, which is the fact that it plays almost like a horror movie. And for as dark as other Batman portrayals have been, we never got that before with him. There have been scenes that one can argue are unsettling, but this is the closest we've gotten to Batman going full-on horror. Not just for what the Riddler does to people, or what the film implies the Riddler does with people, but even in the way Batman himself is handled. Similar to how the Riddler is this looming presence over the entire movie, Batman is a looming presence who hovers over all of Gotham. Like, one of my favorite moments is the opening, where the bat signal is shown and everyone immediately looks around in the dark alleyways expecting him to be there. Batman says in a voiceover how he can't be everywhere all at once, but all those who fear him don't know that. And we'll get these lingering shots of these empty alleyways and street corners, and we're holding our breath waiting for him to show up. And while he doesn't, we're on the edge of our seats, anxious to see how things are about to play out. But even in the sequences where he does show up, I loved how they lead up to it, where you hear the loud stomps of his boots, meaning he's approaching. It's like watching scenes in a horror movie where you know the villain's about to show up, even though here it's actually our protagonist. I loved how Reeves subverted horror tropes and used them in such a unique way to introduce the hero of the film. I thought that was brilliant, especially as I'm a big horror fan. Though, the other major part of the film that I can't leave out is Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman, who, even though she and Batman are on the same side, is certainly more morally ambiguous, as opposed to Batman, whose worldview is very black and white. But here, we explore her relationship to the Gotham crime scene as she works in the nightclub that Falcone and his men frequent, and we see how the crimes of the Riddler connect to her backstory. And as we explore that, we see her view of the world and Batman's view of the world clash repeatedly throughout the film, even though their agendas do overlap in several areas. And besides the Batman-Gordon relationship, I thought this was easily the second best dynamic explored here. Honestly, Zoe Kravitz might be my favorite portrayal of Selina Kyle to date. This is a character whose motivations and alliances are wildly different depending on which era of Batman you're looking at. But I thought there was such a great balance to her character. Like, there are times you're clearly rooting for her, while there are other times you sympathize with her, but you might think she crosses this line in several instances, and so on. And it brought so much nuance that ultimately tied into the movie's themes regarding being a source of vengeance versus being a source of inspiration, which is also a big part of Batman's journey. And as someone who's not always the biggest fan of ultra dark, gritty movies in general, if you watch the way these character arcs unfold, it makes complete sense why this takes on the tone it does. And without spoiling the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it, I liked how it ended things from a tonal perspective. Like I said earlier, you shouldn't have a movie just be dark and depressing just for the sake of it. And I think the way this handled that particular tone and the way it progressed, it actually adds a lot of character development to Batman, making him an extremely compelling protagonist. And it has me looking forward to where they take things with the sequel, as it seems like this won't be exactly more of the same without it feeling inconsistent with what was already established. All I'll say is, I just hope that when we do get to the sequel, that we explore newer territory with this universe. Like, we get some villains and storylines that either have never been explored before in a Batman movie or haven't been explored in a really long time. Because as great as this was, we've seen a lot of these characters done before, like Catwoman, Falcone, the Penguin, and so on. And we've seen a Batman from early on in his career already. Like, that's what the Nolan films are all about. So, with Batman having arguably the best rogues gallery in all comic book history, even when you look at his lesser known villains, and considering we've seen intriguing portrayals of some of these lesser known characters in things like Batman the Animated Series and the Arkham games, it would be cool to see how some of them would be handled in a sequel in this universe rather than continuing to rehash villains that have already been portrayed a number of times in live action film already. Because I think that would be the much more interesting route to take with this universe. The Batman is another memorable outing in the Batman filmography, and easily one of the better films of the year so far. Rather than taking on the traditional action-packed superhero route, we instead get a horror-inspired detective drama with some David Fincher influences thrown in there that make for an eerie film noir with an engaging mystery that hooks you in for 3 hours. The world building this film does is top-notch, with a nice balance of so many different storylines propelled by great performances from all of its cast, with some highlights being Pattinson, Kravitz, Wright, and Farrell. It's a new era for Batman, and I look forward to seeing where things go for him. And if you haven't seen this yet, you're really missing out. The Batman gets a 9 out of 10. Matt Reeves, you've done it again. I gotta say, while this wasn't at the very top of my most anticipated movies of the year, it once again sees Reeves exceeding my expectations, so I was really happy with how this turned out. But let me know, did you see The Batman, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this your new favorite of the Batman movies? Is Robert Pattinson your new favorite Batman? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.